Section 14, Samsara and Nirvana. So Sangharakshita starts off with this section talking about whether Nirvana can be conceived of simply as a cessation of negative mental states, cessation of the wheel of life, or cessation of the 12 Nidana chain that we looked at in the last section, or whether that it could also be understood as the development of positive mental states. And to his excitement, he finds that it can be understood as unfolding positive mental states. We can find Praticca also expressed as the 12 positive nidanas, or the spiral path as we know it. And this spiral path can be found actually in different formulations all throughout the Pali Canon. And you can really sense Sangharakshita's excitement here. He quotes Mrs. Rhys David as saying, it's like finding an oasis in a desert of negations. Because this is so important for the spiritual life. It really, really is. Because the spiritual life isn't just about getting rid of the things that make us suffer. It's also about developing positive mental states that lead us all the way to liberation. It can also be conceived in a spiritually positive sense. So this is a real emphasis of Sangharakshita's, and we can really feel his delight in this section when he talks about it. And he also quotes Dr. Barua. Dr. Barua, who wrote a paper based on a lecture answering the question, is Praticca an all-inclusive formulation of reality or not? If it is an all-inclusive formulation of reality, does it include nirvana itself? So Sangharakshita gives a long quote from Dr. Barua answering this question. And we have found that there are some inconsistencies within this essay. He quotes extensively from the Kula Vedala Sutta, which is found within the Majjhima Nikaya, and it's a discourse of Dharmadina. So, yes, there are some interpretations that he has of that sutta itself, which does come under question, and you might want to read a paper actually that Sagramati wrote called The Strange Case of Beni Barua and the Teri Dharmadina. So yes, there are a few points that you might want to look at in there. One of the things is that he quotes a spiral path that comes from Dharmadina with nirvana at the end, which isn't quite what Dharmadina says. So he says, is nirvana contained within the formulation of Praticca or not? And he answers his own question by saying, well, it is, because she gives a spiral path with nirvana at the end. Actually, this is not quite what she says. So what she says is that there are opposites, pleasure and pain. There are opposite counterparts. She also says something very interesting about that. She says that although there is a latent tendency of craving within pleasure, pleasure doesn't always have to lead to craving. And we know this because in the first dhyana we experience pleasure that doesn't have the latent tendency or the anusaya towards craving. And she says there is a latent tendency within pain that can lead to aversion, but that it doesn't always have to lead to aversion. Painful experience doesn't always lead to aversion. And she says we know this because we sometimes experience a longing to be one of the noble ones, a longing to be free from suffering and to attain nirvana. That's not quite how she puts it, but yes, a longing to be one of the noble ones. And that is an experience of a painful state of mind that doesn't have aversion within it. She says that neutral feeling doesn't always have to lead to ignorance, even though it has a latent tendency towards ignorance. We experience neutral feeling in the fourth dhyana, and that doesn't lead to ignorance. So she's saying something very important here. She's saying that actually, even though we experience Vedana, it doesn't have to send us round the wheel. It doesn't have to send us into craving, aversion and ignorance cycles. That actually it can lead somewhere else. And she does talk about, though she talks about counterparts as opposite, she does go into a different mode, because then she says the counterpart to ignorance, vidya, is avidya, is knowledge, and that the counterpart to knowledge is liberation, and the counterpart to liberation is nirvana. So she's obviously talking about a different order of things at that point, though she doesn't say that's a spiral path. It could be also that those are synonyms for each other. Anyway, that's a debate that you can go into in your group, and once you've read the sutta, just see what she actually says, because it is very interesting. So Dr. Barua's essay does have some limitations, but it's still very important, because it raises a very important question, which is Praticca Samutpada an all-inclusive formulation of reality or not? Does Praticca Samutpada contain within it the possibility to enlightenment? And this is answered by seeing that there is both a cyclical wheel of life, and there's also a spiral path. And the spiral path goes right up to knowledge of the destruction of the asravas. And if one takes that to be nirvana, then yes, it is contained within Praticca Samutpada. The main spiritual import for us is that if we can conceive reality in terms of Praticca Samutpada, within Praticca Samutpada we can be liberated. We can set up the conditions for liberation. What liberation is at the end, what it feels like, how we conceive of Praticca Samutpada at that point, we'll find out. But the main thing is that we can, for our experience now, is that we can set up conditions that lead to enlightenment. And those conditions are found within the spiral path. On dependence upon faith, kind of freedom from remorse arises, joy arises, calm arises, bliss arises, meditation arises, knowledge and vision of things as they really are. All these things are possible for us if we set up the right conditions. And interestingly, in one of those spiral path formulations in the Pali Canon, we find the Buddha saying, and it's not dependent on an effort of will. You don't will the next stage. You can't cultivate joy simply by an effort of will. You set up the conditions. Faith will lead to joy. Freedom from remorse will lead to joy, for example. So you can really see why Sangharakshita got so excited about this. It's possible. It's possible for us. It's possible to enter into the spiral path, which is a happy spiral. It's a joyful spiral, even before we're enlightened. So he says it's a bit like this. He says if we're looking in the point of view of time, then we can conceive nirvana as a path of practice, at the end of which is nirvana. If we see it from the point of view of space, we see it as cessation of negative mental states, cessation unconditioned by greed, hatred and delusion. So yes, from one point of view, there's a path leading to nirvana, a spiral path. And from another point of view, we cease to experience the negative mental states of greed, hatred and delusion. And he says this is reflected in Nagarjuna's, the first two of Nagarjuna's 4 shunyatas, which is saying that the compounded, the conditioned, is empty of the unconditioned. So if we look at the wheel of life and the 12 nidanas in that sense, that cyclical wheel of life, cyclical nidanas, they are empty of the spiral path. But if we look at the unconditioned, the higher reaches of the spiral path, the uncompounded, they are empty of the wheel of life. Of course, Sangharakshita doesn't mention that Nagarjuna goes on to say that distinction itself is empty, and that even the conception of emptiness is empty. Sangharakshita also quotes the Yogacara, saying that within the storehouse consciousness we have positive seeds as well as negative seeds. And the spiritual life, therefore, isn't just about getting rid of the negative seeds. It's about sowing positive seeds and nurturing positive seeds and watching them grow. So it's very important that one doesn't just think about one's own life just in terms of getting rid of the things we don't like about ourselves, our negative mental states, the things that make us suffer. That's important, but it's also important to see that we have spiritual potential. Going back to an earlier section, that latent within every sphere of consciousness is the possibility of enlightenment. And we can allow that to grow as well. We can nourish that. We can nourish the seeds of goodness in our lives and conceive of the spiritual life as unfolding positive mental states that are not even dependent on a force of will.